The drive to Ravenwood was one David Reynolds had been putting off for months. His grandmother's house, nestled in the middle of dense woods and miles from the nearest neighbor, had always been a place of quiet dread for him. The air smelled of mildew and pine, the way it had when he was a child. David killed the engine of his truck and sat staring at the house. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the windows looked like empty, unblinking eyes. The memories weren't happy ones: summer visits filled with scoldings, strange noises in the night, and his grandmother's unrelenting rules. As he stepped inside, the air was stale and cold despite the July heat outside. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. The house was exactly as she'd left it, cluttered with antiques, religious trinkets, and family heirlooms. He sighed, knowing this was going to take days to clean out. The attic was the last place he wanted to go. It always had an oppressive atmosphere, even as a kid. But he needed to sort through the boxes for anything valuable. The trapdoor creaked as he pulled it open, and the ladder groaned under his weight. The attic was dimly lit by a single, dusty bulb. He sifted through boxes of moth-eaten clothes and old photos until he saw it, a small chair placed in the corner, and on it sat a doll. It was porcelain, with delicate features and glassy blue eyes that reflected the weak light. Its hair was auburn, styled in tight ringlets, and it wore a frilly Victorian dress. Something about it was deeply unsettling, though David couldn't pinpoint why. He reached out hesitantly to pick it up. The doll was heavier than he expected, and as he held it, a strange chill ran down his spine. "Creepy little thing," he muttered, placing it back on the chair. As he turned to leave, the bulb flickered. He paused, glancing back at the doll. For a second, he could have sworn its head had turned slightly, its glassy eyes now staring directly at him. David shook his head. "You're imagining things," he told himself, hurrying down the ladder. That night, he dreamt of the doll. In his dream, it was alive, its tiny hands clawing at his face while its voice, eerily similar to his grandmother's, whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." David woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. On the nightstand beside him, the doll sat upright, its glassy eyes fixed on his. He was sure he'd left it in the attic. David stared at the doll, frozen. His first instinct was to rationalize: there was no way it had moved on its own. Someone must have brought it down from the attic. But who? He was alone in the house. He picked it up cautiously, its porcelain body cold to the touch. The doll's painted lips were curved in a faint smile, almost mocking. He marched back to the attic, climbing the creaky ladder 2 steps at a time, and placed it back on the chair. "Stay here," he muttered under his breath, as though the doll could understand him. David locked the attic door behind him and spent the rest of the morning sorting through the living room. Stacks of old magazines, rusting tin trinkets, and yellowed photo albums filled box after box. The work was mind-numbing, but it kept his mind off the strange encounter. By mid-afternoon, he was in the kitchen, eating a hastily thrown-together sandwich, when he heard the first noise, a faint scraping, like wood dragging against wood. He paused mid-bite, his ears straining. It came again, louder this time. David followed the sound to the staircase, dread building in his chest. The attic door was ajar. "Nope," he whispered to himself, shaking his head. But he couldn't ignore it. He crept up the stairs, his heart thundering in his chest. The attic was dim, the single bulb casting long shadows. The doll was no longer on the chair. Instead, it was on the floor, sitting upright in the center of the room, facing him. David cursed under his breath, backing away. "This is just my imagination," he said aloud, his voice shaky. He picked the doll up again and threw it into an old chest, slamming the lid shut and locking it. That night, the nightmares returned. In his dream, David was a child again, sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table. The doll was there, perched across from him, its painted smile widening into a grotesque grin. "Do you remember, David?" it whispered in his grandmother's voice. "Remember what?" Dream David asked, trembling. The doll's head snapped sideways, revealing a gaping hole where its face should have been. Out of the darkness, he heard the faint sound of a baby crying. David woke up gasping, his hands gripping the bed sheets. The room was dark and silent, save for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He tried to calm his breathing, telling himself it was just a dream. Then he heard it, the soft, rhythmic tapping of porcelain fingers against the hardwood floor. His blood ran cold. The following day, David was determined to figure out what was going on. He searched the house for clues, rifling through old documents, journals, and anything that might explain the doll's strange behavior. In the bottom of a wooden chest in the guest room, he found it, an old, leather-bound journal that had belonged to his grandmother. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about gardening, weather, and recipes, until he came across a page marked with a black X. March 3, 1956. "I did what I had to. The doll keeps the secret, but the price was so much higher than I ever imagined. It cries sometimes. It screams at night. I think it hates me. I can't get rid of it, it always comes back. God forgive me for what I've done." David read the entry twice, his heart pounding. What had his grandmother done? He flipped through the journal frantically, but the entries became sparse and incoherent after that, filled with half-finished sentences and frantic sketches of the doll. That evening, as David sat in the living room with a glass of whiskey, the lights flickered. He stared at the attic door, half expecting it to swing open. "You're losing it," he muttered, taking another swig. But then he heard the faint sound of a child laughing, echoing from upstairs. He froze, his stomach turning. The sound was distant but unmistakable, the high-pitched giggle of a little girl. Gripping a flashlight, David climbed the stairs. The attic door was still locked, but the laughter grew louder as he approached. His hand trembled as he turned the key and pushed the door open. The doll was there, sitting on the chair where he'd first found it. Its head tilted slightly, as if watching him. David's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Then, in the pitch black, the voice came again, soft and mocking. "You shouldn't have come back." By morning, David was done playing games. He grabbed the doll, drove 20 miles to a junkyard, and hurled it into a scrap heap. "Let's see you get back from that," he muttered as he drove away. But when he returned to the house, the doll was sitting on the kitchen table, its head cocked to one side. David stared at the doll on the kitchen table, his breath catching in his throat. Its glossy blue eyes seemed to mock him, daring him to question its presence. His rational mind reeled, searching for an explanation. "I threw you away," he said aloud, as though speaking to the doll would break whatever spell had been cast. The doll, of course, didn't respond. David grabbed it again, gripping its fragile porcelain torso tightly, and stormed outside. He opened the lid of the backyard fire pit, threw the doll in, and lit a match. The flame caught quickly, and for a moment, he felt relief. He watched as the doll's delicate dress blackened and curled in the heat. The porcelain didn't melt, but it cracked, a spiderweb of fissures forming along its face and body. Then came the scream. It started as a low, guttural moan, growing louder and higher until it became a piercing wail. David stumbled back, clutching his ears. The fire flared, unnaturally bright, and then extinguished itself, leaving the pit dark and cold. When David looked again, the doll sat unscathed in the ashes, its face as perfect as ever, except for one change: its painted lips had curled into a sinister grin. That night, David barricaded the attic door with furniture and bolted the bedroom shut, but the sense of dread lingered. Every creak of the old house sent chills down his spine. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The silence was oppressive, pressing against his ears like a physical weight. Then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But soon, they became distinct. David. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. David. The voice was soft, familiar, and chillingly calm. It was coming from the attic. The next morning, David made a decision. This wasn't just a prank or his imagination, something was wrong. He drove into town and found the library, determined to learn whatever he could about his grandmother's past and the origins of the cursed doll. The librarian, an older woman with thick glasses, listened intently as David explained his situation. "Your grandmother's name was Mary Reynolds, you said?" David nodded. The librarian led him to the archives, where they found a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1956. The headline sent a shiver down David's spine. "Local girl disappears under mysterious circumstances." The article detailed the disappearance of a 6-year-old girl named Abigail Turner. She had been last seen near the woods behind David's grandmother's house. Despite a thorough search, no trace of her was ever found. David leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling. His grandmother had never mentioned this. "There's more," the librarian said hesitantly, pulling out another clipping. This one was an obituary for Abigail Turner. The date of death was listed as March 3, 1956, the same date as the disturbing entry in his grandmother's journal. That evening, David confronted the doll again. He sat it on the kitchen table and glared at it. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice shaking. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the lights flickered, and the air grew cold. The doll's head turned slowly to face him, and its glassy eyes blinked. David recoiled, nearly knocking over his chair. "No," he whispered. "This isn't real." The doll's lips parted, and a soft, raspy voice emerged. "She paid the price. Now it's your turn." David's resolve cracked. He called a paranormal investigator he'd found online, a man named Victor Lane. Victor arrived the next morning, a stocky, no-nonsense man with salt and pepper hair and a bag full of equipment. "This doll," David said, showing Victor the porcelain figure, "it's alive. Or cursed. Or something." Victor studied the doll carefully, his expression grim. He held a small device over it that began to beep erratically. "There's definitely energy coming off this thing," Victor said. "And not the good kind." "What do I do?" David asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Victor shook his head. "Cursed objects like this are usually tied to something, a traumatic event, unfinished business, or a deal gone wrong. Destroying it won't work. You have to figure out what it wants and resolve it." David's stomach churned. He thought about the newspaper clippings, the journal, and the eerie coincidences. "I think it's connected to my grandmother. And a girl who disappeared a long time ago." Victor nodded. "Then we start there. But be warned, whatever this thing is, it won't give up easily." As night fell, Victor set up cameras, motion sensors, and audio recorders throughout the house. David was grateful for the company, but the oppressive atmosphere seemed worse than ever. At 3 a.m., the activity began. The cameras caught shadows moving where there was no light. The motion sensors tripped repeatedly, even in empty rooms. The doll moved, first an inch, then across the room entirely, captured on film. Victor's audio recorder picked up a chilling whisper, "She promised me." David's stomach dropped. "Who promised you?" he shouted into the darkness. The doll turned its head toward him, its grin widening. "Mary." David felt the weight of the name crash over him. His grandmother had done something terrible, and now he was paying the price. The following morning, David felt like he hadn't slept in weeks. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and every sound in the house seemed magnified. Each creak of the floorboards or gust of wind set his nerves on edge. Victor, calm but grim, reviewed the evidence they had collected. "It's clear this thing is tied to your grandmother," Victor said, spreading out the recordings and photos they'd captured. "And it's not just angry, it's vindictive. Whatever your grandmother did, this entity isn't letting go until it's repaid." David ran his hands through his hair, his mind racing. "But how do I repay it? I didn't do anything. I didn't even know about this until a few days ago." Victor's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "You're part of her bloodline. That's enough. This curse isn't about justice, it's about revenge. And it's coming for you." That evening, David returned to the journal, desperate for answers. He flipped through the brittle pages again and again, until a passage caught his attention. "Abigail keeps calling to me. Her cries echo in my head. I thought the doll would keep her silent, but it only made her angrier. I see her now, in the shadows, her face pale and her eyes empty. She wants something from me. She wants what I can't give back." The words sent a chill down David's spine. "Abigail, she's the spirit in the doll," he muttered. Victor nodded. "It sounds like your grandmother tried to bind her spirit to the doll. Maybe to control it, or silence it, but it clearly didn't work." David stared at the doll, which now sat on the coffee table. Its glassy eyes seemed to follow him wherever he moved. "Why would my grandmother do this?" Victor hesitated, then said, "The girl's disappearance, Abigail Turner, was it an accident? Or something worse?" David shook his head, his voice trembling. "I don't know. But I'm going to find out." The next day, David went back to the library. With the librarian's help, he combed through old police reports and court records. What he found made his stomach turn. According to witness statements, Abigail had often played in the woods near his grandmother's house. One day, she wandered off and never came back. A week later, Mary Reynolds was questioned by police after a neighbor claimed to have seen her burning something in the backyard the night Abigail disappeared. David's pulse raced as he read the final report. Due to lack of evidence and absence of a body, the case was closed. Mary Reynolds remained a person of interest until her death in 1997. That evening, Victor returned with a grim expression. "I've been researching binding rituals," he said. "Your grandmother likely tried to trap Abigail's spirit in the doll to protect herself, but she didn't know what she was doing. The ritual was incomplete." David's voice cracked as he asked, "So what do we do now?" Victor placed a hand on David's shoulder. "We finish it. Properly." The ritual was planned for midnight. Victor prepared the house, marking the walls with protective symbols and setting up candles in a circle around the doll. He explained that they would need to confront Abigail's spirit, acknowledge the wrong that had been done to her, and offer a way for her to move on. David wasn't convinced it would work, but he was desperate. As the clock struck 12, the house grew deathly quiet. Victor began chanting in a low, steady voice, the words foreign and guttural. The candles flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Then the doll began to move. Its tiny hands twitched, and its head turned toward David. A cold, unnatural wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. Victor's voice rose above the chaos. "Abigail. We summon you to speak. Show yourself and tell us what you want." The shadows in the room deepened, and a figure began to take shape, a small girl with hollow eyes and tangled hair, her white dress stained with dirt. David's breath caught in his throat. "Abigail." The girl's voice was faint but filled with pain. "She took me, she made me stay. I want to go home." David stepped forward, tears in his eyes. "I'll help you," he said, his voice shaking. "I'm so sorry for what she did to you. Just tell me how to make it right." Abigail's hollow gaze fixed on him. "You can't." Before David could react, the girl lunged at him, her form dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows that enveloped the room. The doll, now levitating, spun wildly in the air, its porcelain face cracking and reforming into a grotesque smile. Victor shouted something, but his words were drowned out by the deafening roar of wind. David fell to his knees, clutching his head as visions flooded his mind. His grandmother standing over a terrified Abigail, the doll clutched in her hands. A sharp scream. Flames consuming something small and fragile. And then silence. When David came to, the room was still. The doll lay shattered on the floor, and Victor was slumped against the wall, unconscious but breathing. David's chest ached with the weight of what he'd seen. He knew now that his grandmother hadn't just trapped Abigail, she'd killed her. And in doing so, she had damned their family. But the worst realization was yet to come. As David looked around the room, he saw a shadow in the corner, a figure with hollow eyes and tangled hair. Abigail wasn't gone. David sat in the wreckage of the living room, his hands trembling. The shattered remnants of the doll lay scattered across the floor, but its curse was far from over. Abigail's shadowy figure lingered in the corner, her empty eyes fixed on him, her presence suffocating. Victor groaned and stirred, clutching his head as he struggled to sit up. "What happened?" "She's still here," David whispered, his voice hollow. "Breaking the doll didn't end it. She's not leaving." Victor's face hardened as he took in the shadowy figure. "The binding wasn't about the doll itself," he muttered. "The doll was just a vessel. The curse is tied to you, your bloodline. She doesn't want the doll destroyed. She wants retribution." David's mind raced. The visions of his grandmother, the screams, the fire, they all pointed to one thing: Abigail wasn't going to stop until justice was served. But how could he give her peace when the crime had been buried for decades? The rest of the day passed in a haze as David and Victor tried to piece together their next move. The oppressive atmosphere in the house only grew worse. Lights flickered constantly, the air was cold and heavy, and David couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Victor finally spoke, breaking the tense silence. "We need to do something drastic," he said. "There's a ritual I've read about. It's dangerous, but it might sever the curse. We'd be giving Abigail what she wants, a chance to confront the person who wronged her." David frowned. "But my grandmother's dead. How is that supposed to work?" Victor hesitated. "The ritual can create a link between the living and the dead. If we perform it, we might be able to summon her spirit. But I need to warn you, it's not just Abigail we'll be dealing with. Your grandmother will come back exactly as she was when she died. Angry, defensive, and likely just as dangerous as Abigail." David swallowed hard, dread curling in his stomach. "Do we have another option?" Victor shook his head. "None that will work before Abigail tears you apart." They began the preparations that evening, gathering ingredients Victor had brought and a few that David found around the house. Salt, candles, a mirror, and a small lock of hair from an old locket belonging to David's grandmother. Victor explained the process step by step. They would create a protective circle, light the candles, and use the mirror to draw the spirits into the physical world. The goal was to mediate the conflict between Abigail and Mary, forcing the truth to come out. Once the truth is exposed, the spirits may release their hold, Victor said. Or, things could go horribly wrong. David didn't like the vagueness of that last part, but he nodded anyway. The ritual began just before midnight. David and Victor stood inside the protective circle, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows across the room. The air was thick with tension, and every creak of the house felt magnified. Victor began chanting in a low, resonant voice, the foreign syllables carrying a strange weight. The room grew colder with each word, and the mirror placed in the center of the circle began to fog up. Then, slowly, an image appeared on the glass. It was Abigail. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but there was a flicker of emotion, sadness, anger, desperation. Victor's chanting grew louder, and the mirror fogged again. This time, a second figure emerged, Mary Reynolds. She looked older than David had ever seen her, her face twisted with guilt and defiance. The temperature dropped further, and a deafening wind swept through the room. The two figures stepped out of the mirror, their ghostly forms flickering like dying flames. Abigail's voice was soft but sharp. "You promised me. You promised I'd go home." Mary's voice was shrill, defensive. "I did what I had to. You don't understand." David stepped forward, his voice trembling. "What did you do, Grandma?" Mary's ghost turned to him, her expression a mix of rage and regret. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way. She wasn't supposed to die." Abigail's form shimmered, her anger rising. "You took me. You left me in the woods. You burned me." David felt like he was going to be sick. "You killed her?" Mary's ghost flinched but didn't deny it. She was going to ruin everything. She saw something she shouldn't have, and I panicked. I thought the doll would quiet her spirit, keep her from haunting me. Abigail screamed, a piercing wail that shook the house. Shadows burst from her form, swirling like a storm. The candles flickered violently, and the protective circle began to break. "Victor!" David shouted. Victor grabbed his hand, his voice urgent. "You have to confront her. Acknowledge the truth. Apologize. It's the only way to end this." David turned to Abigail, his heart pounding. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry for what she did to you. I know it doesn't fix anything, but you didn't deserve this. No one deserves this." Abigail's shadowy form paused, her hollow eyes locking onto his. For a moment, the storm quieted. Then she turned to Mary. "You can't hide anymore." Mary's ghost shrieked, her form distorting as Abigail's shadows enveloped her. The two spirits clashed, their screams merging into an unholy cacophony. The house shook violently, and David and Victor ducked for cover as furniture toppled and windows shattered. Finally, there was silence. When David opened his eyes, the room was still. The spirits were gone, and the oppressive weight had lifted. Victor sat slumped against the wall, exhausted but alive. "Is it over?" David asked, his voice hoarse. Victor nodded weakly. "For now." But David couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. As he glanced at the shattered remains of the mirror, he saw it, a faint reflection of Abigail, her hollow eyes watching him from the darkness. The days that followed were a blur for David. Though the house seemed quieter, it didn't feel safe. The oppressive cold had dissipated, and the flickering lights were gone, but he still felt Abigail's presence. She wasn't haunting him actively, there were no more whispers or moving shadows, but she was there, lingering on the edge of his perception. Victor had left after the ritual, his parting words both reassuring and ominous. You confronted the truth, and that's powerful. But curses don't always disappear, they change. Be careful, David. David tried to move on. He told himself that the worst was over. But deep down, he knew the curse wasn't finished with him. It started with the nightmares again. In his dreams, David was back in the woods behind his grandmother's house, searching for Abigail. He could hear her crying, faint and distant, but no matter how far he ran, he could never reach her. The forest grew darker with every step, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. And then he would see it, the doll, sitting in the middle of a clearing, its cracked porcelain face smiling at him. You didn't save me, Abigail's voice would whisper. David would wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of her voice echoing in his ears. One morning, after another sleepless night, David noticed something strange. The house, which had always been cluttered with his grandmother's belongings, was slowly changing. Items he knew he had packed away began reappearing, old photos, religious trinkets, even the antique chair from the attic. They would be in odd places, the middle of the hallway, the foot of his bed, or the kitchen table. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But then he found the doll. It was sitting on the mantel above the fireplace, its face pristine despite having been shattered during the ritual. David froze, his chest tightening. No, he whispered. You're gone. You're supposed to be gone. He grabbed the doll and threw it outside, hurling it as far as he could into the woods. He watched it land, tumbling into the underbrush. But when he returned to the house, the doll was waiting for him on the kitchen table, its head tilted as if in amusement. David was losing his grip on reality. He began seeing Abigail everywhere, in reflections, in shadows, in the corner of his eye. Her hollow eyes and tangled hair haunted him, a constant reminder of his grandmother's sins and his own inability to fix them. Desperate, he returned to Victor. She's still here, David said, pacing Victor's cluttered living room. The ritual didn't work. She won't leave me alone. Victor listened carefully, his expression grim. You said you apologized to her. That was a good start. But did you give her what she truly wanted? David stopped pacing. She wants justice. But how can I give her that? My grandmother's dead. The crime happened decades ago. There's nothing I can do to make it right. Victor leaned forward, his voice low. Curses are about balance. Abigail doesn't just want justice, she wants restitution. A life for a life. David felt his stomach drop. You're saying, she wants me to die? Victor didn't answer directly. There might be another way. If you can find her remains and lay them to rest, it could break the curse. But you'll need to do it properly, with her permission. She has to want to move on. David returned to his grandmother's house, dread gnawing at him. The woods behind the house were dense and overgrown, but he knew he had no choice. He grabbed a shovel and ventured into the trees, guided only by the faint, lingering sense of Abigail's presence. The further he walked, the darker the forest seemed to grow. The air grew colder, and the sounds of birds and insects faded away. It felt like the woods were watching him, waiting. Finally, in a small clearing, he found it, a patch of earth that felt wrong, the soil darker and looser than the rest. He began to dig, his hands trembling. After what felt like hours, the shovel struck something hard. David knelt down and brushed the dirt away, revealing the skeletal remains of a small child. His heart clenched as he stared at the broken, fragile bones. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You didn't deserve this." Abigail's shadowy form appeared at the edge of the clearing, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "I found you," David said, his voice shaking. "I'll make it right. I'll lay you to rest." Abigail stepped closer, her presence cold and heavy. For a moment, David thought she would attack him, but then she nodded, a faint glimmer of emotion crossing her ghostly face. David buried the remains in a small cemetery near the house, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. He whispered a prayer, not knowing if it would help but hoping it would bring some peace. As he finished, he felt the air lighten. Abigail's presence was gone. For the first time in weeks, David felt a glimmer of hope. But that night, as he lay in bed, he heard it again, the faint sound of porcelain fingers tapping against the hardwood floor. He sat up, his heart racing. The doll was there, sitting on the dresser, its cracked face grinning at him. And then, Abigail's voice, soft and mocking. "You thought it was over. But it's just beginning."